welcome to today's first session of the Bancroft Library Centennial Symposium. As Charles mentioned, I'm Jack von Euw, and I do want you to know that the exhibit is on upstairs. It will open at 11. Again, there will be a talk by my colleague Tony Bliss, curator of the Rare Books collection, at noon today. And so my job here is to introduce the speakers for this part of the program. On my immediate left, your right, is Isabel Breskin, who Charles mentioned was co-curator of this exhibit, and without her, it would have been a very difficult and tough thing to do. Isabel Breskin conducted much of her dissertation research at the Bancroft Library, and she was awarded a Bancroft Fellowship in 2001. She received her doctorate in art history from UC Berkeley in 2002. Her dissertation was entitled Visualizing the 19th Century American City, Lithographs of San Francisco, 1849 to 1905. She is co-author of the recent publication Masterworks of American Painting at the DeYoung Museum, and as I mentioned, was assistant curator for the exhibition Bancroft at 100. Our next speaker is Michelle Morton, who completed her PhD in literature at the University of Santa Cruz, and she did her dissertation research at the Bancroft Library and was a Bancroft Fellow also in 2001. Her dissertation examined early descriptions of California in popular literature and primarily writings by the Mexican Californians after 1848. Currently, Michelle is a postdoctoral fellow with the Council of Library and Information Resources, working with my curatorial colleague, Teresa Salazar, as curatorial assistant to the Latin Americana collection at the Bancroft. Michelle's presentation is called Literary Perceptions, California in the Colonial and Early National Imaginaries. And then our last but not least presenter today is Professor Margaretta Lovell, who is a professor of art history at the University of California, Berkeley. She received her PhD in American Studies from Yale and has taught in the history of art departments at Stanford, Harvard, Yale, the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor. Professor Lovell has held the Dittman Chair in American Studies at the College of William & Mary and the Edna Root Curatorial Chair for American Art at the Fine Arts Museums of San Francisco. Professor Lovell's teaching includes a broad spectrum of courses and seminars, including architecture and design in the US, British and American art of the 17th and 18th century, landscape painting and photography in America, Sergeant Whistler and Mary Cassatt, Homer and Eakins, folk art in America, American domestic architecture, and my personal favorite, The American Forest, Its History, Ecology, and Representation with Joe McBride. She's also done food in American culture with Kathleen Moran, and the collecting enterprise and material culture theory with Pat Berger. Professor Lovell's presentation is called Bancroft and the Big Trees. I'd like you to welcome our panelists. Thank you very much.
Before I get started, I'd just like to thank Charles Faulhaber and Jack von Euw for giving me the opportunity to work on the Centennial exhibition. It was a great honor and a great pleasure. When you visit the Bancroft Centennial exhibition in Gallery 4 upstairs, you will find this letter in one of the cases. It was sent from San Francisco in 1851 by L.B. Sewell to the Reverend J. Sewell in Maine. For his stationery, Sewell chose a pictorial letter sheet. Letter sheet production flourished between 1849 and 1869 in California, publishers issuing illustrations of fires, assassinations, earthquakes, hangings, comic and serious depictions of mining life, as well as views of California's burgeoning cities and small but hopeful towns. As you can see from these examples, some illustrations left very little room for actual letter writing. On other sheets with plenty of blank space, correspondents added only a couple of lines, letting the image do the bulk of the explaining. The Honeyman collection at the Bancroft includes these and dozens of other wonderful examples of pictorial letter sheets. Sewell has chosen a view of San Francisco from Nob Hill, looking down California Street toward the bay. A ruff of bushes in the foreground marks the edge of the city. Beyond lie neat, if somewhat featureless buildings, streets busy with people, and the harbor busy with ships. Here and there we can pick out recognizable city sites. The larger buildings bordering the plaza. The signal at the top of what is now Telegraph Hill. And over here, the great storeship Apollo at its dock. The wave of the city's growth has only just begun to lap at the base of Telegraph Hill and Rincon Hill. It is a tidy vision of the city, with straight streets, 4 square houses, and ample room to grow. In his letter, L.B. Sewell is similarly interested in presenting the city in its best possible light. He admits he is writing in haste, quote, as the steamer is on the point of sailing, unquote, but he takes the time to describe the city that is his new home. Quote, many of the buildings here would be an ornament to Boston or New York. Its beautiful iron buildings particularly attract the eye of the stranger. Its streets are well graded and paved with plank laid with a convex surface. Sewell's, end quote, Sewell's description of San Francisco strongly resembles the accounts of the city given by travel writers and civic boosters. Those professional writers never fail to mention the substantial buildings that ornamented the city, for instance. Indeed, Sewell's tone is so cliched and formal, we almost wonder if a tardy son is quickly copying a text he has at hand in order to finish his letter before the steamer sails. He seems to have forgotten the actual state of many of San Francisco's streets, and to be ignoring its more makeshift structures. For the state of San Francisco streets would be a common complaint, and its cramped canvas and wood buildings a tinderbox for fires for years to come. The apparent willingness of Sewell and the lithographer to overlook the realities of the rough, raw city around them becomes even more startling when we consider how these prints of San Francisco were marketed to potential purchasers. Between 1849 and 1905, hundreds of images of the city of San Francisco were printed, both lithographs and engravings. Viewmakers would often herald the production of one of these prints with an announcement in the local newspapers, and they would liberally sprinkle those announcements with a stock vocabulary of accuracy, using words such as faithful, correct, accurate, graphic, faultless, and truthful. Viewmakers worked hard to assure potential purchasers that their prints captured the city as it really was. And certainly, if these images were going to function effectively, they needed to have at least the aura of accuracy. In many views of the city, such as this beautiful 1872 print by Francis Michelin, that aura was generated by the inclusion of small quotidian details, representative people from the city's population, and a point of view that sighted the viewer securely at the city's edge, as well as the depiction of architectural and geographic landmarks. Those landmarks became iconic features of San Francisco that simply had to be included in any description or representation of the city. Telegraph Hill, indeed hills in general, the crowded harbor, the plaza, Yerba Buena Island. These elements strongly, emphatically signaled San Francisco. And so it was with the view that Sewell selected for his letter home. The lithographer has not included people, but otherwise hits his marks perfectly, and so produces a sanitized but credible image. It lacks the charming detail of this view, yet still it has that aura of accuracy. So, view makers made strenuous, repeated assertions of accuracy in newspaper announcements, but it is up to us to ask, accuracy to what? Certainly, and obviously, view makers were attempting to record an actual place that was made up of houses, shops, hotels, warehouses, and so on, that are, to a greater or lesser degree, identifiable. We can compare any of these prints to our knowledge of the city and assess the view's correctness. But the demands of accuracy go beyond that. There are other aspects of the city to consider. For to be accurate to the city that actually is may do a disservice to the city of history or the city of memory. Similarly, the ideal city may be slighted if one adheres strictly to a standard of accuracy based on what was really there. Personal experience gives special personal contours to a place that demand their own brand of accuracy. On pictorial letter sheets, two modes of seeing and imagining the city meet. In the image, an idealized, conventional vision of the city. In the letter, a subjective, highly individual point of view. Looking at a few more examples of the letter sheets will allow us to see how the differences in those modes of seeing the city were negotiated by the letter writers. On November 7th, 1858, H. Cruz, a new arrival to San Francisco, wrote a letter to his children. Cruz's letter is one of the very few pictorial letter sheets in the Bancroft's collections which has not been made available online. So here I'm showing an 1860 printing of the same view. It's not actually Cruz's letter, though. Like the view on Sewell's letter, the image that accompanied Cruz's letter shows wide, straight streets running down to the water and tidy clusters of buildings. A few people and the occasional horse and cart dot those streets, but the impression is one of order and not the bustle of busy commerce. Cruz is very quick to point out the shortcomings of the picture. He wrote, "I herewith send you a picture of this city, but I do not want you to think it is a fair representation of the city, for it looks nothing like it." Cruz reported that he had not fully explored San Francisco. Quote, "I have been out this afternoon to take a walk and see the city, but did not go far," unquote. Yet he already had a sense of the inadequacies of the illustration. Cruz reported that Telegraph Hill, bare in the illustration, is actually, quote, "nearly all covered with houses. At night, when they have light in them, they look like stars, for you cannot see any of the houses, nothing but the lights." Cruz, unquote. Cruz paints his own picture of San Francisco for his children, correcting not only the factual mistake of omitting the houses, but also conveying a sense of the magic of the city, how those houses shone like stars. Even walking down the street in this new place was a novel experience. Quote, "The streets are most all paved or covered with plank sidewalks, and the crowd of people walking on them makes a strange kind of rattling noise," end quote. Cruz added sound to his picture, a new and surprising sound, the hollow thumps and clomps that must have been an oral backdrop to every aspect of city life. And suddenly, the letter sheet illustration is revealed as impossibly quiet. Cruz added a note to his wife in the letter. He can't send her money as he promised. He didn't work at all last week. He is earning $6 a day this week, but doesn't know about next. He is struggling not to be discouraged. Cruz's poignant note adds another dimension to his experience of San Francisco. In addition to the magic and mystery conjured for his children are the doubt and confusion confessed to his wife. While he initially reports on the failure of the image to capture the scale of San Francisco's landmarks, it's ultimately the clarity and order of the image that Cruz finds false. Cruz's disappointment in the city was all too common, but his disappointment in the letter sheet image of the city was unusual. The unknown writer of an undated letter, probably composed in 1854, provides the recipient with a rich mixture of civic information and personal detail, interspersed with slight corrections to the image. The panoramic view extends across the full width of the folded sheet, providing a broad vista of the growing city. The tour of the city provided is such a wonderful mix of the personal and the public that it's worth quoting a number of pieces of it. This is a detail. Quote, "The high point, number 1, at the north end of the city is Telegraph Hill, and the point here, where the gentleman and lady are standing, is nearly as high as that. I mention it because in the engraving it does not seem so high. The island, number 4, should be a little more to the right. It is Alcatraces, 4 syllables. I have marked with a dotted line the course of the steamers as they come in from the sea. You see, they pass along the north of the city, heading nearly east, to lay beyond Telegraph Hill, and then wheel directly south to their wharf, and scarcely any part of the city is visible till you come around on the east side of it. Number 8 is the City Hall. And right in front of it is the open space which they call the plaza. It is at present in poor condition, but will one of these days be an ornament to the city. Number 10 is the Montgomery block. My office, where I am now writing, is on the north side of it, and number 11 is the house we live in now. While the writer finds mistakes in the view, they do not deter him from conducting his verbal tour of the city. He quickly corrects them and moves on. He adjusts the location of Alcatraz Island, for instance, and also makes certain his reader will be able to pronounce it properly, revealing a particular concern for correctness. He tuts mildly about the condition of the plaza, but then immediately adopts the optimistic tone of the booster and the language repeatedly used to describe prominent civic architecture, an ornament to the city. Yet he does not neglect the personal. He gives a sense of what it feels like to arrive in San Francisco, the course the steamer takes, the sudden turn to the south, the city exploding into sight. And he locates himself, where he is writing and where he lives. The numbers sprinkled through the image give the various points of interest: the writer's office, the Golden Gate, the plaza, his house, a kind of equivalence. This is a highly personal indexing system. Another letter writer, Walton, used the same letter sheet to write to his mother on the 28th of April, 1854. Unlike the anonymous writer, he has no quibble with the view's accuracy and begins his missive, "The above picture is a very good view of this city at the present time." He too adds his own identifying numbers, but positions them along the top border and gives precise measurements to the correct location. For example, 2 inches directly under Figure 1 is Telegraph Hill. 2.5 inches under Figure 2 is Mr. Miggs' Wharf, 1,200 feet in length, and so on. In Walton's letter, we see a similar mix of the standard landmarks and more personal sites as appeared in the anonymous letter. A good booster, Walton often includes laudatory facts in his mentions of civic landmarks, such as the impressive length of Miggs' Wharf, or the fact that the Mint coins $150,000 a day. Also, like the unknown writer, Walton locates both his place of residence. 3¼ inches below Figure 4 is about the place where I board, and where he is as he writes the letter. Quote, 2 inches and 5/8 below Figure 10 is near the locality of LeCount and Strong's bookstore, in which I now am, end quote. He has probably just purchased the letter sheet and is using a conveniently empty counter to pen his message. The impulse to locate the self within the city is common in these letters. Another letter sheet, showing the scene at the post office after the arrival of the steamer bearing mail, also inspired correspondents to locate themselves within the depicted city. In the image, a crush of men press through the doors of the post office, and more mill around outside in the open square. A long printed description describes the interminable wait, always hours, sometimes days, to learn if one has letters or not. After the tedium of working his way up the line, the lonely San Franciscan finally reaches the front. The printed text describes the effect of the clerk's news. Quote, "The announcement that there are no letters for him falls harshly upon his ear, and with the speed of thought settles upon his countenance a shade of gloom and disappointment. Friends in the Atlantic states, could they but for a moment witness the scene, would be more punctual in their correspondence, for it would be no pleasing sight to notice the disappointment of a husband, a father, a brother or friend, caused perhaps by their negligence." The letter sheet was clearly created for those whose relatives had been neglectful, providing a pre-printed guilt trip to send home. The text humanizes and individualizes the anonymous crowd of men who hurry to the post office in the image and urges recipients to imagine their loved ones among them. One correspondent, however, felt the need to drive the point home even harder. In the top margin of the sheet, he has drawn a hand, an arm, and written, "Ned is in this crowd." You can see that here. Another hand points to the title of the sheet, and an additional note at the bottom accuses, "E.A. Perry gets his letters, some do not." Another copy of the same sheet includes a long letter laced with misspellings. The author complains that although he has been away from home a year, he has received only 2 letters. At the close of his missive, he draws an arrow directing his reader's attention to the image and printed text on the reverse side. In both cases, the writers rely on the letter sheet to express something they could not, or not as well. And in both cases, the writer identifies himself, explicitly or implicitly, with the figures in the scene and the disappointed man in the text. As we have seen, in addition to marking the places where they lived, writers felt an additional need to show the actual place from which they were writing. That the views afforded the opportunity to include the writer's personal experiences speaks to their aura of accuracy. If they were too fanciful or blatantly incorrect, it would be hard for the writer to include himself there. Even when the city was tidied up, when the geography was a bit off, or the streets sketchy, writers could, with confidence, mark a spot on the views and say, "Here I am." H. Cruz's failure to designate his home, or the place where he writes in the image, is perhaps a result of his recent arrival. He does not yet feel a part of the city. He is a sojourner, not a resident. And indeed, he describes himself twice in the course of his short letter, walking through the city, a still restless and unrooted person. That the letter writers would add their own marks to the sheets is not surprising. They approached the images with pen already in hand. Even the stilted Sewell made a crosshatch mark on the summit of Telegraph Hill, and a corresponding one in the body of his letter. It's a little faint, it's right there. But even as the writers engaged with the views, they were not blind to their errors and omissions, as we have seen. Before slipping into the booster's conventional language of civic pride, Sewell remarks that the image he sends is, quote, "an extremely rough sketch." Others found their pictures tolerably correct, very tolerable, or even very correct. But whatever the writer's judgment, all found in the views an image that resonated. These assorted examples show us that ultimately we have to think of accuracy not as an objective standard, assessed by comparing a print with old photographs, maps, or letters, but rather as a measure constantly negotiated and renegotiated between viewer and view. The relative value of the truths the view tells and the way in which it dissembles cannot be determined simply by establishing what the buildings looked like and where they stood. Such facts reveal a certain amount about the city, but not the willingness with which the urban audience overlooked, appreciated, cringed at, or accepted the glosses, exaggerations, inaccuracies, and downright lies that found their way into the pictorial letter sheets. Just as the city constantly changed under the influence of tragedy, progress, decay, and growth, the relationship between the city, its representations, and standards of accuracy also changed, depending on who was looking and when. Thank you.
Morning. Thanks for coming out so early. I'm going to sketch out some of the characteristics of some of the most popular writing by Europeans and Americans on Spanish and Mexican California, and I'm going to look at two narratives in a little more detail towards the end. Thomas Jefferson Farnham's Travels in California, published in 1844, and Bayard Taylor's very well-known El Dorado, Adventures in the Path of Empire, published in 1850. And my main area of research is Mexican California and Mexican Californians after the Mexican-American War, who also called themselves Californios. And I came to these narratives because when I was looking at the California material in the Bancroft Library, the dictations, the family papers, the legal papers, they express a lot of concern over these early popular narratives, and they talk about them a lot, especially the Californios that write their own histories of California. And when I went back to look at them, I was really amazed by how widely they circulated and how influential they were in perceptions of California. These narratives represented California for most of the world. They established a narrative on Spanish and Mexican California that was very enduring, and they were often taken as fact. The distinct circulation and reception of California writing on the region, and visitor accounts of California shaped both California history and historiography in significant ways. And it established a set of images and ideas that Californians felt compelled to respond to. While there's a wealth of documentation by the Spanish colonial government and by the Mexican government on early California, and much of it is at the Bancroft Library, these records didn't enjoy the same kind of circulation and readership and influence that works by early European and American writers did. Accounts of state-sponsored expeditionary voyages, such as that of Jean-François de La Pérouse in the 1780s and George Vancouver in the 1790s, were immediate bestsellers, and they were published and translated into They were republished and translated into dozens of languages and read by prominent philosophers, scientists, merchants, and politicians of the period. This is the title page to La Pérouse's narrative of his visit to California, and on the side there are some of the places where it was reprinted in the years that followed. La Pérouse and Vancouver's works were in Thomas Jefferson's library, and they influenced his interest in the West and in trade with the Pacific, helping to shape his vision of the United States as an empire of democracy. La Pérouse's journals, published by the French government in 1788, were the first of many accounts by visitors that were embraced as the authoritative version of life in California. These explorers were also reading and citing each other's works. Let's see, to go forward. This is a later edition of, I think it's an 1849 edition of John Fremont's Geographical Memoir upon Upper California. And in that text, I'm not sure if you guys can read it, but it cites many of the popular accounts of California: Langsdorff, La Pérouse, Hastings. And so they're reading and citing each other's work and creating sort of its own genre on California. The subscriber list, pictured here, to George Heinrich von Langsdorff's Remarks and Observations on a Voyage Around the World from the years 1803 to 1807, includes royal families, ministers, booksellers, and libraries across Europe, trade and theological societies, doctors, professors, etc. These ambitious voyages and their accompanying narratives were concerned with exploration, science, natural history, politics, and economics. And this is the dedication to the king of the Beechey narrative of his voyage to California in the 1820s. And towards the middle of the dedication, he talks about all of the things that these expeditions accomplished, that they're productive of national renown, useful in diffusing the blessings of civilization over distant and savage lands, beneficial to science and commerce. So these are very ambitious productions. Langsdorff's account is a classic text of late colonial natural history, documenting California's flora and fauna and speculating on native Californians' capacity for reason and their participation in European society. And the Bancroft collection is especially rich in accounts from these expeditionary voyages, both in the narratives and the documentation, but also in the images. And many of these are in the exhibit. And also, I have a few images from, you can see this focus on natural history, from Langsdorff's sketches with the Rezanoff expedition. This is another Langsdorff sketch that is in the exhibit. This is from Ludwig Choris, the artist of another Russian expedition. And William Smythe with the Beechey expedition. These early scientific accounts are concerned with the progress of the Spanish colonial project of civilizing and domesticating native people. Their interpretations, shaped by Enlightenment scholarship and Spain's wane as an dominant imperial power, are critical but not wholly dismissive of either Californios or native Californians. Narratives from the Mexican period increasingly focus on Californios as failed agents of civilization, condemning the mixture of different races and classes in the territory, the political turbulence of revolutionary California, and California's soon-to-be famous indolence and dissipation. Sir George Simpson typifies this view that California's underdeveloped state reflected California's moral inferiority as a population who had, quote, turned the very bounty of Providence into a curse, unquote. Most striking about Simpson's narrative is his censure of Californios for living off nature's bounty instead of working the land. Quote, here was California in a nutshell, nature doing everything and man doing nothing, a text on which our whole sojourn proved to be little but a running commentary. British and American narratives of the late Mexican period encapsulate the kind of beliefs that fueled popular support for Western expansion, and I'm going to list some of these that appear over and over again in these narratives. Mexico was not a fellow New World republic, but the degraded offspring of an ancient empire. Mexico was incapable of developing industry, agriculture, or free trade. Mexicans were degraded by their mixture with native people. Mexicans abused native peoples but could not control them. And Californios, in particular, were slothful and lived off the labor of others. This period marks a shift in travelers' attitudes towards native people and the possibilities for their participation in civilized society. Essentially, this whole question drops out of the American narratives. They're no longer concerned with the possibility of integration of indigenous people. To generalize, their depictions of Mexican California as a degenerate society on the verge of collapse convey the urgent and impending transfer of California's bounty to a more capable hand, and this tone really culminates in the literatures of American expansion. Popular literature by American explorers and settlers inhabits this colonizing discourse on California from their particular perspectives as citizens of an emerging U.S. empire, identifying what they saw as the failings of the Latin race and the qualities of American character as a new kind of agent of civilization that made the U.S. occupation of northern Mexico providential destiny. Unlike British and French accounts, the earlier British and French accounts, many U.S. narratives on California from the 1820s through the 1840s were produced by individual travelers. And while they are highly nationalistic, these personal narratives recount one man's adventures in the wild. Nation, race, and empire continue to be used as interchangeable terms, but these narratives, again, decisively shift their ethnographic focus from native Californians to Californios. They're not the same kind of natural histories that include native Californians as part of the landscape. And they draw especially on the language of the Black legend and the idea of mongrelization. The heroes of these narratives are sailors, trappers, and explorers. They are men with names like Buckshot, straight out of a James Fenimore Cooper novel. As Bayard Taylor observed, immigrant tales from, quote, the California Crusade sounded more marvelous than anything I had heard or read since my boyish acquaintance with Robinson Crusoe, Captain Hook, and John Ledyard, unquote. So these accounts from the beginning were produced as stories. They were meant to entertain a wide audience, and they were active in both evoking and creating classic tropes of American nationality and masculinity. Trapper and explorer James Patty's personal narrative from 1831, published in 1831, the first American account of life in California, was written in collaboration with a novelist. More straightforward guidebooks, such as John Fremont's report and Lanford Hastings' Emigrant's Guide, also drew on the language and the imagery of frontier novels, and particularly in their promotion of Western men, and their inevitable comparisons of industrious and democratic Americans with idle and despotic Californios. Fremont's nickname, the Pathfinder, is again from a Cooper novel, the title of a Cooper novel. But despite their autobiographical and explicitly semi-fictional status, they, like European narratives, have been very influential as historical documents. Richard Henry Dana's 2 Years Before the Mast, for example, published in 1840, in an expressly personal narrative, generally classified as a work of literature, is often cited as fact, while California narratives are often dismissed as fanciful or unreliable. Here's an image of Richard Henry Dana. His novel, 2 Years Before the Mast, cemented the image of Californians as, quote, an idle, thriftless people who can make nothing for themselves, end quote. And this, again, was a bestseller. It has never gone out of print. It's in print to this day. And at the Bancroft Library, I wanted to take a picture of it. There's like 2 entire shelves that are just editions of 2 Years Before the 2 Years Before the Mast. And this is another one of the strengths of the Bancroft collection, that you have all these popular narratives, but you also have them in different editions and languages, so you can see some of the ways that they circulated. The caricature of the decayed gentleman, quote, decayed gentleman, dissolute and extravagant when the means are at hand, ambitious at heart but impotent in act, helped the American public establish distinctions between industrious, deserving farmers and members of an ancient society that blocked the way of progress. And this new kind of breed of civilizing but populist rhetoric is evident in travel literature, immigrant guides, letters, and journals from the Gold Rush period, from the 1840s and 50s, actually. Thomas Jefferson Farnham's Travels in California was published in 1844 and reprinted in several expanded editions in the years that followed the war and the discovery of gold. His popular account further illustrates this convention of contrasting the spirit of the Saxon and the Spanish race and an escalating discourse of mongrelization. And I have a couple of long quotes I'm going to read here, so I put them up if you want to follow. Quote, the American population must go westward. No one acquainted with the indolent mixed race of California will believe that they will populate, much less for any length of time, govern the country. The law of nature, which curses the mulatto here with a constitution less robust than that of either race from which he sprang, lays a similar penalty upon the mingling of the Indian and the white races in California and Mexico. They must fade away. Farnham illustrates the shift in focus in American narratives from native Californians to Californians as people incapable of progress or industry. And while he makes a few dismissive comments about native Californians, Farnham and his fellow Americans are not invested, or even interested, really, in the colonial project of converting and civilizing native people. Their disappearance is at this point a foregone conclusion for these writers. In Farnham, we also see the development of the classic Western hero, and he talks a lot about Isaac Graham, because when he arrived, Graham had been imprisoned and charged with conspiracy, and he was later sent to Mexico by Governor Alvarado, and Farnham writes this defense of Graham. And Graham was in the midst of many political events in California. He was a trapper from Tennessee who had opened a distillery in Santa Cruz. And this is another long quote from Farnham describing Graham. A stout, sturdy backwoodsman of a stamp which exists only in the frontiers of the American states, men with the blood of the ancient Normans and Saxons in their veins, with hearts as large as their bodies can hold, beating nothing but kindness till injustice shows its fangs, and then, lion-like, striking for vengeance. A man was this Graham, who stood up boldly before his kind, conscious of possessing physical and mental powers adequate to any emergency. He had a strong aversion to the elegant edifices, the furniture, the wardrobe, the food of polished life, coupled with a vivid love of mountain sublimity, etc. And you can see how he literally lionizes Graham and really perpetuates this idea of the capable Western mountain man. Fremont's report is also a very popular narrative from this period. Often described as the best account of the gold rush and one of California's greatest books, Bayard Taylor's El Dorado, Adventures in the Path of Empire, was hugely popular, selling tens of thousands of copies in the United States and Europe, and again remaining in print until the present. And this is a German edition of El Dorado in the Bancroft Library. Sent by the New York Tribune, Taylor left New York by ship in June 1849, joining the thousands of American immigrants en route to California. Taylor's is a more nuanced and sympathetic portrait of Californios in post-conquest California. But he is also very taken with the idea of American empire, as you can see by the title, and the promise of California, as well as what he sees as settlers' capacity for self-government under anarchic conditions. In his eloquence as a writer, Taylor captures the national feeling that expressed in many of these accounts, the adventure of imperial expansion and civilization not as religious conversion or philosophical enlightenment, but as industry and commerce. Raised in a Quaker family and holding liberal views on the rights of women, Native Americans, and African Americans, Taylor's enthusiastic embrace of the expansionist program indicates the prevalence of these positions. California, for Taylor and others, shows American spirit in its very best light, as immigrants crafted a, quote, harmony evolved out of so wonderful, so dangerous, so magnificent a chaos. And this is another quote. One of the clipper ship advertisements for trips to San Francisco. There's a wonderful collection in the Bancroft Library, and I think most of them have been digitized and are online. This is Taylor's description of the minefield soon after he arrived. From the beginning, a state of things little short of anarchy might have been reasonably awaited. Instead of this, a disposition to maintain order and secure the rights of all was shown throughout the mining districts. In the absence of all law or available protection, people met and adopted rules for their mutual security. This capacity for a people for self-government was never so triumphantly illustrated. Never, perhaps, was there a community formed of more unpropitious elements. Yet from all this seeming chaos grew a harmony beyond what the most sanguine apostle of progress could have expected. And I want to contrast Taylor's experience in the mines to that of Californio Antonio Coronel, who is in the mines during the same period and describes the lynching and driving out of foreigners, people perceived as foreigners. On the top, there's the image from his dictation, and the bottom is the translation and transcription. There was no effective legal authority to protect the rights or the lives of peaceful men against evildoers. In fact, there was no law at all except might makes right in those times. In self-defense, the decent people had to adopt the principle of an eye for an eye. As I said as I began, I came to these popular narratives on California through the California materials. Over and over again in the California materials at the Bancroft Library, you see a palpable desire to correct these representations made popular by Dana, Farnham, Simpson, and others. California writers and historians took up writing as a mode of redress, as a self-conscious intervention into public opinion. And this is Mariano Guadalupe Vallejo, who wrote a history of California and worked with Bancroft. This is another history written by a Californian who chose to relocate after the war and moved to Baja, Antonio Osillo. Another amateur California historian, Juan Bendini. And then just one of my favorite pictures of Pablo de la Guerra, Salvador Vallejo, and Andrés Pico, three major figures in California history. California's critiques of popular narratives California and their production of corrective histories demonstrates their sense that these writings have tangible political consequences. For me, the beauty of the Bancroft Library is this diversity and depth that the collection offers. You have these traditional accounts in many editions and very comprehensively, but you also have wonderful California materials and other materials that many people have talked about at the symposium. And in that sense, it enables us to reimagine California, past and present, in more complex and inclusive ways. I also want to close by just saying something about my experience as a postdoctoral fellow with the Council on Library and Information Resources at the Bancroft Library. It's been very enlightening to move behind the scenes as a researcher and to realize that I didn't have the first clue as to the monumental effort that goes into maintaining this collection and making it accessible to the public. As someone who cares deeply about these materials, I have to say I really value the dedication and the professionalism of the Bancroft staff, and they're truly amazing. I also believe that there is a lot of untapped potential for collaboration between librarians and faculty, and that work that is truly collaborative can be very productive and beneficial to both parties. Thank you.
This truly impressive array of sound bites and case studies vignetting the usefulness of the Bancroft Library to thinking and to creating new knowledge, both today and in the recent past, mine is really a modest, in fact, a parenthetical inclusion. It really broaches only one object and one for which I make no claims for greatness. But it provides a model of a kind, I think, in a sense maybe an anti-model to the relationship that is usually assumed, in fact, usually operative between teaching and research. That is, while most academics strive and labor to insert some of their research into their teaching, I have repeatedly found that elements of my teaching have found their way into the beginning of research projects, and this is such a story. Some years ago, the Hewlett Foundation graciously offered seed money to fund courses or course-related costs for UC faculty in order to develop courses that bridged that abyss between the two cultures, between science and the humanities. So when I was approached by Joe McBride, a faculty member in forestry here, I somewhat rashly agreed to give it a try, to begin to develop a course that eventually was called The American Forest, Its History, Ecology, and Representation. This, in fact, was the course, exactly the course, that I had hoped to take as a graduate student and looked for back at Yale. But neither my mentors nor any of the facilities of that institution could approach. My mentors couldn't even understand what I was trying to find and the kind of learning and thinking that I was trying to do. And there's a good reason, and that is because this involved not only a collaboration between humanists and scientists, but also an excursion, also a hybrid kind of thinking that involved cultural geography, physical geography, forest science, economic history, and American studies. It's a different way of looking at this continent and at the inhabitants of this continent and how they used and understood their forests. And last, of course, I was interested in what those forests have to say about us when we turn around and look at them as, in fact, effected and in some degree created by human action. My part, I expected, in this course would be pretty straightforward. I was thinking of drawing on Thoreau's Walden, on Bierstadt's Yosemite, as well as my long-term research into woodworkers, that is to say, carpenters, joiners, cabinet makers, and my own leisure hours as a woodworker. I like wood. I like trees. I like lumber. I like forests. I thought this is going to be fun. From Joe, I anticipated learning the scientific names for trees that I knew only by their humanist or lumberyard nicknames. White poplar, tulip poplar, white oak, Douglas fir. I wanted to learn why they grew where they grew, why they grew in conjunction with other species, and how fire and grazing and lumbering and recreation and other intrusions changed the forests. In short, how forests worked as systems, and how professional foresters have theorized their job descriptions for the last century. Now, academics are pretty much solo practitioners in their classrooms, or at least humanists are, and so they look askance at the idea of co-teaching. But I suspect that all of those of us who have tried to co-teach courses, to develop courses taught with other faculty members, do so because of us, what you could call a kind of rapacious appetite for learning and really more for remedializing. That is to say, learning things we had wished we learned earlier. Things were going pretty well as we were developing this course, its goals, the central concept, and the syllabus. We were ambitiously deciding to look at all of American forests from the 17th century to the present in the lower 48 states. But when we got to the idea of what are we going to assign students to do, what research are we going to ask our students to do that synthesize these disparate fields, that's when things got a little sticky. I asked Joe what he usually asked undergraduates to do as research projects in his courses, and he said, well, he sometimes gives them little seedlings and asks them to carefully record the inputs of water and chemicals and soil composition over the course of the term. And then at the end of the semester, to burn their seedling and to measure the biomass. I was trying to figure out how to get a bridge from Walden to this little pile of ash. And it wasn't working. I thought, okay, we have to start over. We have to really start thinking hard about this. What we decided to do, what we came up with, was to give each of these undergraduates a package, a little packet of 4 or 5 documents. Primary sources, because I believe in primary sources. And they included maps They included paintings and engravings. They included scientific descriptions of forests. They included, Thomas Jefferson's Notes on Virginia with his lists of species. They included lumber cruisers' assessments of certain landscapes for the economic potential of the lumber on that land. And incidentally, I'm going to get to Bancroft. Can I have the lights down here, please? They included poems. They include passages in novels, including Mark Twain. But since I am an art historian, they centrally did include paintings. Now, Bancroft, as you know, has books and manuscripts and letter sheets and account books and photographs and papyri. It also has paintings. In fact, it arguably has a better collection of paintings than the institution in which we sit right now, the University Art Museum. This is a pair of paintings, portraits really, of two trees. These trees have names, personalities, eccentricities, and hence I call these portraits. This is Thomas Hill's The Wawona and the Grizzly, up about 1890 in the Bancroft collection, listed as oil on panel. Putting together this assignment prompted me to begin thinking about trees as culturally appropriated artifacts. On the right, a Carlton Watkins grizzly giant, Mariposa Grove, 1861. The grizzly giant was, for instance, named, visited, photographed, measured, positioned as a kind of champion for the forest that it dominates as a symbol. Like all of California's big trees, it was celebrated for its longevity, for taking the long view, for asking us to take the long view in human affairs, a reminder of the trivialness of human lifespans. This is a slice of a giant sequoia that was cut down in 1919 and carefully noted 30 feet above the ground. This slice was taken 30 feet above the ground. The tree was determined to be 1,100 years old and 14 feet across at the base. The little tags indicate Columbus's discovery of America, Magna Carta, Gettysburg Address, and such monumental moments in human history. Empires rise and fall, and these leviathans of the forest endure, teaching us, if we're listening, humility, or as one speaker put it yesterday, human inconsequentiality. Clubs were formed to pilgrimage to these groves, encouraging a kind of secular nature enthusiasm, or worship, if you will. This is an early photograph of the Sierra Club, about 1910. This enthusiasm for nature became characteristic of our culture in the 19th century. It had not been in the 17th and 18th century, but very much so in the 19th century, and of course continuing through the 20th century into our own day. Here's another giant sequoia, christened affectionately the Mother of the Forest, photographed in 1872, again by Carlton Watkins. He is a fabulous photographer. He positions the Mother of the Forest in the center of the image, bracketed by two similar behemoths in the foreground. The Mother of the Forest is the tree around which you'll just be able to make out some scaffolding. Sometimes it was felt that statistics like 305 feet high or 9 feet in diameter, 30 feet above the ground, apparently were not impressive enough. This is another photograph by an unknown photographer of the Mother of the Forest. The title of the photograph written on it is The Mother of the Forest, 305 feet high, Mammoth Grove. In a move, perhaps defensive on the part of Californians, concerning accusations of humbuggery in their statistics and even their photographs of these trees, the bark was stripped from the Mother of the Forest. That's what that scaffolding is all about. And as you can see on this closer photograph, this tree is now barkless. and shipped to Europe in slabs, reassembled there to demonstrate the truth claims for these vegetable giants. Now, that's not very good for the tree, but I expect that the perpetrators knew that this would carry the day in Paris, which in fact it did. Interestingly, Disney, in their new California Adventures theme park and the Grand Californian Hotel in Anaheim that opened in 2001, include in the hotel swimming pool a water slide that memorializes the re-erection of this empty bark stump in Paris. This is, in fact, a simulacrum of that erection of that bark stump of the mother of the forest. And it is here presented in, of course, synthetic Disney form for those interested in the phenomenon, but not interested enough to go into the forests of Northern California to see the thing itself in its own habitat. As you can see, brooding on the assignments concerning the grizzly and the wawona prompted me to think hard about what it means to make a portrait of, to name, or to put on exhibition, whether as a painting or as an empty bark stump, exemplary big trees. This is a wood engraving by an unknown wood engraver of boring pump augers, published in Scribbler's Monthly, January 1872, explaining exactly what was being devised in terms of technology at exactly the same moment that these big trees were being named and celebrated and measured and understood to represent the foreverness of life on Earth. Exactly at this time, the lumber interests were developing technologies to turn these trees into dimensioned lumber. To build, of course, the booming cities of the region, such as San Francisco, booming in Isabel's paper a moment ago, and still booming on the horizon today. Happily for the giant sequoia, this species proved too difficult to fell, and the appetite for beautifully straight, insect-resistant lumber fell mostly onto the coastal redwoods. Thanks to the Hewlett funding, we were able to take the students to Yosemite and to Mariposa Grove nearby. In fact, Isabel Breskin was a GSI in the first iteration of this course, the first time we taught it. For most of the students, this was their first opportunity to see these culturally potent giant sequoia, or the forest ecologies that supported them, or to study the sites that had supported and inspired generations of artists and writers that they had studied, including, of course, John Muir, Albert Bierstadt, Ansel Adams, Thomas Hill, and many others. For some of the students, it was their first experience of snow. We always have to, we taught this course 3 times now, and we always have to stop and have a snowball fight. In their course evaluations, the students all pointed to this excursion as the high point of the class, or the high point of the year, or in some cases, students reported this was the high point of their undergraduate years. Unfortunately, this funding expired, and although we continue to teach this class, the hands-on dimension of California's forests as our laboratory, taking the students to Muir Woods and to Yosemite, has become increasingly difficult and endangered. So while you're writing that big check for the Bancroft, to push Bancroft over the top, you might think about writing a little check to your favorite department to encourage field trips and field excursions on the part of faculty with their undergraduates. Well, the forest course clearly has been a success from the point of view of the students, and really from the get-go. The humanists really did love to learn about temperature gradients and the geologic accidents that created the underground water pockets that support these great trees. I learned that the course had been a success when the students, writing about the Bancroft paintings in their term research papers, focused on the central irony of our culture's attitude towards these trees and the forests that support them. The students wove their comments about the artists, the trees, the market for the images, in with comments about the ecology of the region, the cultural history of the big trees, the market for lumber, and the fact that Hill painted these two heartfelt odes to trees that have lived forever on two panels of redwood, remnants of equally thought-provoking trees that have clearly sacrificed their lives to the artist to memorialize these two renowned cousins, the giant sequoia. Bancroft has these paintings to decorate offices, to enliven the reading room, but they also are primary sources of knowledge and part of the huge laboratory of things that UC has collected to enable students and faculty to teach and scholars to do research. Thank you.